My name is Andre Damon. I'm a writer for the World Socialist website and member of the Socialist Equality Party. Today I will be speaking with Joe Kishore, the Socialist Equality Party's candidate for president, and Jerry White, the candidate for vice president, about the stakes in the 2024 presidential election. We are streaming to X, Facebook, and YouTube. If you have any questions for Joe or Jerry, leave a reply on one of the social media streams, or if you're watching on socialism2024.com, leave a comment on the page. As we speak, Israel has just launched a ground invasion of Lebanon as part of a widening war throughout the Middle East. And the Biden-Harris administration is on the verge of allowing Ukraine to strike Russia using NATO weapons. With just 5 weeks until the presidential election, former US President Donald Trump is building a fascist movement and making it clear that he would act as dictator from day one, carrying out mass deportations of tens of millions of people were he to achieve the White House. Joe, this has been called a crisis election. What would you say is at stake this year?
Well, first of all, thank you, Andre, for hosting this discussion, and I welcome everyone who's listening in on different platforms. And I do really encourage all those who are participating to ask your questions and to participate in this discussion. We want this to be a discussion of the critical issues confronting workers and young people in the critical issues confronting workers and young people in this election. Well, yes, it is a crisis election. We are now just 5 weeks, just over 5 weeks until the election, and the situation globally, domestically, is characterized by escalating crisis. Internationally, as you indicated, there is an escalating global war. It is now coming on next weekend, 1 year of the genocide in Gaza, which has officially killed 41,000 Palestinians. We know the real death toll is much higher, as high as 200,000. The genocide is now developing into a broader war throughout the Middle East, as Israel, which rejects all pretense of obeying international law, is carrying out bombings in Lebanon now, as you indicated, ground incursions following the assassination of Nasrallah, the terror bombing attack on pagers in Lebanon. And the war is developing throughout the Middle East. And the genocide, by the way, has also been extended into the West Bank. At the same time, you have the escalation really behind the backs of the population of the US-NATO war against Russia, which threatens to develop into a nuclear war. The US and NATO powers are discussing imminent decision on allowing Ukraine to launch NATO weapons deep inside Russian territory, which would raise the possibility or very likelihood of a direct war between Russia and NATO, with all the consequences that entails. And increasingly, the US and NATO powers see the conflict in the Middle East, the war against Russia, and the developing conflict with China as part of an integrated global war. So there is that, the international crisis. Here in the United States, the domestic crisis. You have one party in this election, Trump and the Republican Party, which is seeking to incite fascist violence, which has made clear that it won't even accept the results of the election. It seems very unlikely, or quite possible, if indeed very likely, that it will not be known or will not be accepted who is the elected president on November 5th. So and there's a real campaign to incite violence. It's centered on the agitation against Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, really vile fascist agitation of really the sort of outpouring of all the filth of the American ruling class and the effort to divide workers and promote backwardness. On the other hand, you have the Democratic Party, whose central priority is war. One should not, in the course of this election, at all forget that the Biden-Harris administration is directly responsible for arming, financing, and politically justifying the genocide in Gaza, along with the whole political establishment. Its central priority, though, is the escalation of war. And it's always seeking to have some sort of agreement with the Republican Party to try to find agreement on the basis of war. Harris was just out in Arizona, where she was adopting large parts of the fascist Republican program, anti-immigrant program, in an attempt to appeal to bipartisanship. So you have the political crisis. You have an intensifying social crisis, which I hope we'll be able to speak about in greater detail in the course of this discussion. Just for the past 2 days, the devastating impact of Hurricane Helene throughout much of the U.S. South and Southeast, which reveals the levels of poverty, the decay of social infrastructure, the starving of the country of resources as everything is funneled into war and the pockets of the financial oligarchy. And I would say, finally, from the standpoint of the ruling class, this is a crisis election in that they are standing atop a social powder keg and are deeply, deeply worried, fearful of the growth of the class struggle. And we see many expressions, initial expressions of a deep social anger in the working class. There's broad hatred of both parties. There's a desire to fight, as we've seen in the strike of Boeing workers on the West Coast, a striving to break free of the control of the trade union apparatus. There's a possibility, although the trade unions are trying to avert it if they can, the trade union bureaucracy if they can, of a strike of dock workers at midnight tonight. So this is an election which is characterized by extreme social, political flux. It will be an intensely volatile and explosive period, and not just the 5 weeks until the election, but of course beyond. And our campaign, which I hope we'll of course be speaking about this evening, the aim of it is to prepare the working class, to develop a leadership in the working class, and understanding of what the tasks it confronts, not just in the election, but after the election.
Well, this next question is for Jerry. You and Joe are on the ballot in Michigan, a key battleground state that could decide the election. In a statement, you noted that the Democratic Party is waging all-out war on third parties. What has been the experience of getting on the ballot in Michigan and other states?
Well, as you say, Andrew, we are on the ballot in Michigan, and it was an accomplishment. We had to rally many supporters to gather over 20,000 signatures because the Democrats and Republicans, of course, do everything they can to prevent any opportunity for the broad social discontent to find political expression, above all, a conscious political expression through the Socialist Equality Party. But we encountered in the course of our petitioning campaign, we're also, by the way, on the state of Washington, New Jersey, and we will be fighting to make sure that we have write-in status in California and other states. But we certainly encounter a deep social discontent. Michigan, of course, is both the center of the auto industry as well as a center of Arab American population, one of the biggest population centers in the U.S. And there is outrage over the U.S.-backed genocide in Gaza, the expanding war against Lebanon, Iran, the fact that the Democratic Party has and Governor Whitmer and the other Democrats have worked with the Republicans to suppress anti-genocide protests on the campuses, and in the working class, where we won very powerful support. There is a deep anger over the efforts of the auto industry, backed by the Biden administration, to carry out a massive restructuring to transition to electric vehicles, above all for economic and political confrontation with China. But in the aftermath of the betrayal of the strike last fall by auto workers, a betrayal carried out by the United Auto Workers bureaucracy, hailed by Biden as a great contract, thousands and thousands of workers have lost their jobs. Next week, another 2,500 workers will be losing their jobs at the Warren Truck plant in suburban Detroit. So there is deep discontent, and the union bureaucracy has been utilized by the Biden administration to keep the home front in check while it expands its global wars for U.S. imperialism's domination. On the other hand, the fact is that Trump is able to get a certain hearing because of the anger with the Democratic Party, including anger with war. And of course, in the course of our campaign, we have fought to emphasize the necessity for the international unity of workers against the fascist agitation of Trump, and to build a powerful political movement of the working class to solve the social crisis. That is through a socialist program.
Joe, did you want to share your experiences of fighting to get on the ballot?
Well, I just, on this, the question of ballot access comes up. You know, the United States, and really no one believes this anymore, American imperialism goes all around the world talking about how it's spreading democracy and waging wars for democracy. Of course, we've seen over the past year the nature of this supposed war for democracy and the slaughter which has been carried out in Gaza, everything done with American bombs. But they talk about freedom and democracy. I mean, the American political system is incredibly undemocratic. I think many around the world, and even in the United States, are not aware. And you talk to workers and explain, they're not aware of what is even required just to get on the ballot if you're an independent candidate. In Michigan, it was 12,000 signatures, which we gathered and we fought for. And it was a major political victory to get on the ballot. In other states, it can be as high as 100,000, 200,000 more signatures. And of course, you have to gather the signatures, and then the Democrats in particular do everything they can to challenge them. They've been going around the country, the Democrats, trying to keep Jill Stein off the ballot, to keep Cornel West off the ballot, even after they satisfy the already onerous requirements to get on the ballot. I mean, it is so undemocratic. And not to speak of the control of money. I mean, this is, I don't know the figures, but this election is going to be no doubt, you know, the most expensive in terms of what the bourgeois candidates are spending to buy the election. I mean, you can't go on YouTube or Facebook without seeing Kamala Harris promoting her election campaign. I mean, the amount of money which is spent, and of course, where does that come from? The corporate and financial oligarchy, which runs both parties. And the fact of the matter is you have two parties which are controlled by an oligarchy, and the whole political system is aimed at preventing, systematically excluding any real expression of the interests of the broad mass of the population, and particularly targeting socialists. So I think that's just an point to really stress. But we have gotten on the ballot in Michigan, and it was a very important victory. And, you know, of course, in discussion, maybe Jerry will also speak more about this, but I mean, countless discussions, and we had supporters from the state and throughout the country. And by the way, I encourage everyone who's on the call now to sign up to get to support the campaign, get updates. We couldn't have done this without the support of many members of the Socialist Equality Party and supporters who helped get us on the ballot. And we need as much help as we can in the final 5 weeks. But it was a major political victory, and it does give expression. I mean, you know, 20,000 signatures we gathered. What does that express about the real sentiment? And I don't know how many thousands and thousands of people we spoke to who said they hate both parties, intensely opposed to the genocide among young people, workers, contemptuous of the Democrats and the Republicans. There's a lot of political issues that have to be clarified. But, you know, if one were to judge the state of popular opinion by the political superstructure of American politics, you would get a very, very false conception. In fact, the country is seething with social anger.
Oops.
We'll be discussing your experience speaking with workers throughout the campaign during this entirety of this broadcast. But I wanted to turn now to the war that's now erupting throughout the Middle East. As we speak, Israeli bombs and white phosphorus artillery are raining down on Lebanon. Israeli troops have crossed the border and are now waging a ground offensive on Lebanon. Now, we're approaching 1 year since the October 7th attacks, which were used by Israel as a pretext to launch the Gaza genocide and now a broader war throughout the Middle East. 1 year in, what has been revealed about the war that the US and Israel are waging in the Middle East?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as we were discussing earlier, I mean, this is one of the points that was stressed by the World Socialist website at the beginning of the genocide was that it had to be understood as an expression or particular expression of a global, escalating global war, that it couldn't really be understood within the framework of the misnamed Israel-Palestine conflict by itself. Although it is also the outcome or the end product of Zionism, a particularly reactionary form of nationalism. But Israel is acting in the interests of American imperialism. At our July 24th rally that we held, and in the course of building it, we stressed that Netanyahu's visit, this was held when Netanyahu came to Congress, invited by both the Democrats and Republicans to Congress, and spoke to the applause of the assembled representatives and senators. We stressed that what that really revealed was that Netanyahu, I mean, the true relationship, that Netanyahu was coming to give a progress report to American imperialism. And it really does. And I think that now, there's a article in The Economist I just got, which is focused on Ukraine, but it refers to a new quartet of chaos which threatens America, citing Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and citing recent remarks by Anthony Blinken. And it explicitly compares it to Bush's infamous old axis of evil, which he outlined in 2002 in advance of the Iraq invasion. And American imperialism sees the genocide and the escalating war in the Middle East in relationship to the global imperatives. I mean, after all, what is in the Middle East? And this is a point I've made in discussions with workers and young people about this, trying to explain what the class forces are that are driving it. What is in the Middle East? It's oil, gas, resources. And what is the imperative for control over the Middle East? From the Iraq war to the developing conflict with Iran, it's control over natural resources. It's bound up with a conflict with Russia, with China. It's driven by a ruling class which is waging war abroad and is waging war at home, and for the same social interest, profit, the amassing of wealth. It's a corporate, and in the criminality as well. I mean, the normalization of genocide. What does that reveal about the nature of this financial oligarchy? All lines are crossed, as I think you wrote in a recent article. There are no more red lines, or appeared in an article on the World Socialist website. And the imperialism is determined to advance, defend its interests at all costs. And the social, and this is, I think we'll have more to discuss, to review about this. Perhaps Jerry wants to speak to this question too. But the central issue of connecting the fight against imperialism with the mobilization, and the fight against the genocide in particular, with the mobilization of that social force that it can oppose imperialism, which is the international working class. That's the key strategic lesson that has to be drawn from the past year.
Yeah, well, I've got a question for both of you. I mean, as you say, it's been a year of really continuous mass protests, and millions of people have taken to the street, and yet the genocide is only expanding. It's continuing, and it's growing into a regional war to remake the Middle East under imperialist control. So what do you think are the lessons that have to be drawn from this entire experience? What are the central issues confronting the struggle against the Gaza genocide and the struggle against war? And this question for both of you.
Well, as you indicated, Andrew, it's also been a year of mass protests, which in fact have been on a global scale. There is no lack of passion and commitment on the parts of millions of young people and workers, the sections of the middle class. They've defied the police repression. They've defied the slanders about being anti-Semitics, and they've continued to protest. But of course, the organizers of these protests are very much sought to tie them to appeals to the Democratic Party in the United States or the Labour Party in England. That is, to the very same forces which are carrying out these wars, appealing to the conscience of the warmongers themselves. And many of these organizations have deliberately disconnected the wars in the Middle East from the war, the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. In fact, they present that war as the good war. And of course, both of these are the expression of the desperate efforts of American and European imperialism to offset, particularly the United States, a deep economic decline, the crisis facing the US dollar, through military power. And as Joe said, the seizing of the oil in the Middle East is critical for China. Now, first of all, Harris has made it absolutely clear. She said, we will make sure that Israel has the weapons to defend itself, that the American military will be the most lethal in the world. And Trump is no pacifist. He, of course, was behind the assassination of Soleimani. He was behind the massive continued funding of the wars. So the real issue is, what social force is that force capable of putting an end to imperialism? And we insist that's the working class. And all over the world, workers are being forced to pay for these wars. In France, they raised the retirement age. In the United States, massive austerity, cuts to public education and other social programs, a tax on pensions. And this is provoking mass opposition in the working class. And the task of the Socialist Equality Party, as Joe indicated, is to help workers connect their day-to-day fight against job cuts, against austerity. By the way, in Chicago, they've announced that they're planning to close scores of schools and lay off thousands of teachers, yet they have $1 trillion for war. We're fighting to connect this struggle against austerity and capitalist exploitation with the fight against war and its source, which is the capitalist system. And that's how we and our youth movement, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, have intervened in these oppositional protests.
Well, Jerry, that's a very good transition to my next question. You've just returned from the West Coast, where you've been speaking to the more than 33,000 Boeing workers who've been on strike for more than 2 weeks. What did workers have to say about the social crisis and more generally the political crisis in the United States?
Well, very much like to speak about that. First, I'd like to extend the condolences from Joe and myself to the family and co-workers of Seth Webb. He's a 24-year-old worker at the Eaton Aerospace plant who was on strike and was killed in a tragic vehicle accident on Saturday night. In fact, just several hours after I had spoken to these workers. Of course, this young man would still be alive if it wasn't for the actions of Eaton Corporation, a massive multinational corporation, which is refusing to pay these workers living wages or pensions or affordable health care. And this is a aerospace company which is a supplier of Boeing. It also happens to supply hoses for missiles that that Ukraine now has. But the Boeing this strike in Michigan, it's in Jackson, Michigan. It actually started just 3 days after the Boeing strike, and that strike erupted as a rebellion by rank and file workers, particularly young workers who cannot afford the impossibly high rental and housing costs in the Seattle area. They are hired to build airplanes at about $20 an hour. So on September 12th, workers voted by 95% to reject a contract proposal brought back by the International Association of Machinists union bureaucracy, and they voted by 96% to strike. And among these workers, there's a deep sentiment that it is impossible to go on. As I said, housing, wages. They want to return pensions that were stolen from them in 2014. But in the course of this, one of the most fascinating aspects of this, and this is such a rebuke to the efforts of Trump and the Democratic Party to whip up divisions in the working class. The picket lines at Boeing in the state of Washington and elsewhere are made up of Laotian workers, Cambodian workers, Filipino workers, workers from South Asia, workers from every country in South America, of course, native-born workers, and in practice, it's a demonstration of the unity of the working class behind its common class interests. And we certainly have discussed with workers. There is also a deep discontent over two things. One, that Boeing, of course, is a massive defense contractor, which makes billions from war, which is why the Biden administration wants to intervene as soon as it can to end the strike. But also that this is a company that sacrificed the lives, the safety of the public for corporate profit. And workers continuously insist that, in fact, they could run these industries far better on the basis of human need if the profit motive did not cut across the rational organization of production.
Well, I think those are critical points. I wanted to go to some questions now, a number of very thoughtful questions about the broader aims of the campaign. Dina asks, how are we going to get the whole working class to unite when we have the servants of the capitalist class dividing and suppressing us? And Declan asks, what are the aims of your campaign? Your goals are very noble, and I want to back you with what I have, but I want to know more about your aims.
Well, if I might take that, well, I think the answer to the first question, Jerry began to answer, and what he spoke about in relationship to the Boeing strike. I would say that, in terms of the uniting the working class is, in a sense, objectively united in the process of production, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. It has common class interests, which are bound up with the fact that we are all exploited by the same companies for profit, often now in global, well, really in the production of anything, global supply chains involving workers from all over millions of workers from all over the world. And as Jerry was indicating, you have at Boeing, and also really at every major company, workers of different races. In the course of this vicious attack on Haitian workers in Ohio, we spoke to an auto worker who was talking about how when he's now retired, but when he was working, many of his coworkers were Haitian. He used to try to use an app for translating so that he could try to communicate with them. I mean, workers are, united in the process of production. Now, as you say, the ruling class does everything it can to divide workers, divide us by nationality, to pit, it takes different forms, to pit workers in the United States against workers in Mexico or China. They're stealing our jobs. Of course, one hears that continuously, and not just from the fascist Trump, but also the trade union apparatus has a long and really filthy history of promoting nationalism. They divide us, by race. And here the Democratic Party plays a critical role in the promotion of racial identity politics, which has as a central aim the effort to divide workers, the whole narrative of, that the problem in America is white privilege, which the Democrats promote. We'll tell that to the hundreds of white workers in Appalachia who've had their lives destroyed by Hurricane Helene over the past week. Or the more, of course, there's now more than 100 dead. The central issue is class. The ruling class seeks to divide us. Well, how do we counter that? Well, we have to fight. There's an objective unity, but we have to fight to make that conscious. And that gets to the second point. What are we trying to do with our election campaign?
Yeah, what are the aims?
Well, fundamentally, it's to develop a conscious socialist, internationalist, political movement in the working class. There's no solution outside of that. Our aims are not electoral in that sense. We very much want to get as large a vote as we can, and we're campaigning for that. where we're on the ballot in Michigan, Washington, New Jersey, and we are seeking write-in status in other states. But our aim is not fundamentally electoral, and we don't lie to workers and claim that, well, somehow that is going to resolve the problems. Jerry and I are going to find ourselves in the White House, and then we're going, everything is going to be fixed. No, the issue upon which everything depends is the development of a movement in the working class, a mass struggle within the working class, which is guided by a clear political perspective. And that means fighting to build a socialist leadership in the working class. That's the foundation upon which one can counter all of the ideological propaganda, lies, filth, and everything else emanating from the decay and rot of bourgeois politics in America and throughout the world, one must add. This is not just an American question by any means. But that is the basis. We have to build a political movement in the working class, a leadership in the working class, a political movement that will fight to arm the working class with an understanding of what it has to fight for, not just in this election, and primarily in this election, in the course of mass struggles. This country is an international. We're in a period of social upheaval, of immense class battles. The other side of imperialist war, objectively, is social revolution, and the same contradictions that produce imperialist war produce social explosions and the objective basis for revolution. But that it has to be made conscious. So what is our aim? Why are we running in this election? It's to fight for that, to fight against the Democratic Party and all its appendages, to fight against the malign, noxious, dangerous influence of Trump and this attempt to cultivate a fascist movement, to develop within the working class an understanding of what its interests actually are, what it has to fight for, and to win workers and young people, students who are drawing conclusions about the genocide in Gaza and this colossal experience, sections of the middle class who are principally want to fight for socialism, to win over and develop a socialist leadership. And there's not endless time. We see what's happening. So that's the aim of our election campaign. I really encourage you to make a decision to be involved. Again, to fill out the form. I also encourage everyone on this call to donate as much as you can to our election campaign. Obviously, we don't have the support of Musk and others, and the corporations and the billionaires and the corporate media. We're fighting to get this election campaign known as widely as possible, distribute leaflets, go out to as many factories and workplaces as possible, get out, to really spread the message of this, the perspective of this campaign as broadly as possible. So make a donation, get involved yourself, sign up for our updates. I think there's a form. There's a form there, the URL, where you can volunteer for the campaign. So I would encourage you to do that. This is a task which we have before us, and we'll continue to discuss this in the course of this evening's event. But everything which, everything in the objective situation, the catastrophe that capitalism is leading mankind towards, the response to that is the need for the building of a socialist movement. Socialism or barbarism, as Luxemburg put it some time ago. That's what confronts us. So that's the aim, fundamentally, of our election campaign.
Well, Joe, we've just got a response from Declan, who asked that question. He says, "Incredible response. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate your honesty. There's much more work to be done outside the ballot." Well, I wanted to turn to one of the issues that you raised, Joe, in your remarks, and that is the consequences of the most recent hurricane that has left hundreds of thousands of people without power, over 120 dead throughout the United States. It's now been close to 20 years since Hurricane Katrina, and it seems that all that's changed is that these types of extreme weather events have only become more regular and their impact more extreme. What lessons do you think have to be drawn from this latest disaster?
Well, I think Jerry might also want to speak about this. He has some also background in this region. I think we wrote on the World Socialist website at the time of Hurricane Katrina a statement that was along the lines of from natural disaster to national national catastrophe. I can't remember the exact. But the point is stressed is that, I mean, you have these storms, and by the way, they are fueled, and the power of these storms increases with global warming, which no section of the ruling class is capable of addressing, including the Democratic Party, despite its protests or claims to be defending science and everything else. They have nothing. But as I said, 19 years since Hurricane Katrina. Well, what has happened? I mean, it's just the conditions which produced it. I mean, the point we stressed at the time is that you have these natural disasters, but their impact cannot be separated from the society in which they are developed. And that goes, by the way, for the pandemic, which I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss as well. But the consequences of poverty. In Katrina, it was the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans and the conditions, which then, the bursting of the levee and Lake Pontchartrain, which then flooded broad sections of the city, a consequence of decaying infrastructure, the poverty in that region. Well, you've had a whole series of such disasters. It seems like every year, or more than one a year, where it just reveals the reality of social life. I mean, in Appalachia, the consequences of decaying streets and bridges that have been wiped out, the impact of deforestation and other predatory capitalist policies and creating conditions for mudslides. The basic fact that you don't have in place in this country mechanisms for evacuating people. There was a time of another hurricane in Florida several years back where we wrote an article on the World Socialist website that was very widely read, tens and tens of thousands, which asks the basic question: why weren't the trains being used to evacuate people in advance of the hurricane? People are left on their own to try some way to get out by car if they were able, and if they couldn't, well, that was it. They were stuck. I mean, basic infrastructure, social needs. Well, why is not? Because everything is subordinate to profit, to war, $1 trillion every year for war, to the massive wealth by the corporate financial oligarchy, and social infrastructure is decimated. So I think this is again one of these really horrific consequences of capitalism, capitalist society.
Barry, did you want to add to that?
Well, of course, also Katrina was utilized. It's a slogan in the ruling elite to never let a good crisis go to waste. They utilized the devastation in New Orleans essentially to privatize the entire public school system, to further gentrify areas. And Joe indicated that I had spent some time covering the struggles of coal miners in the early 1980s and also the late 1980s. And of course, all of these areas of Appalachia are devastated. Years of mountaintop removal, the betrayal of strikes that led to, by the United Mine Workers Union, that led to mass unemployment. And the U.S. government, the Biden-Harris administration, will do nothing to make people whole. People have lost their homes, they've lost their lives. Many of these areas from Florida up north, people are denied any access to flood insurance. The fact is that, as Joe indicated, the whole U.S. infrastructure is collapsing. Earlier in the campaign, I went to the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, and this was at least a 50-year-old bridge with no precautions built around it to deal with massive new cargo ships. And that's just one indication that while trillions have been spent on war and trillions for bank bailouts in 2008, 2020, the whole infrastructure of the United States has been allowed to decay. And the pandemic, as Joe indicated, the response to the pandemic, the prioritization of the stock market and profits to any public health measures to protect the population from mass infection. In fact, the government, both Trump and Biden, promoted mass infection. And they now claim there is no pandemic when close to 1 million a day are being infected.
Well, my next question was actually about that. One aspect of your campaign that's drawn a lot of attention is the fact that whenever you're in close contact with other people, you're both wearing masks. In fact, yours is the only campaign that's taking the pandemic seriously. Last week, Biden said that the U.S. has, quote, turned the page on the worst pandemic in a century. Do you think that's true?
Take it, Joe.
Well, certainly not. I mean, the pandemic is ongoing. I was just looking at the latest figures. There are 669,000 infections a day in the United States. It has been for most of the past several months over 1 million new infections a day. In the course of this pandemic, and of course, with the continued spread of the virus, there's the continued mutation of the virus, which creates the conditions for the emergence of new strains, which are resistant to the existing vaccines. The whole response of the ruling class to the pandemic has been, in a sense, it has been to subordinate public health to private profit, to systematically promote anti-science conceptions. And there, it's not just a question of Trump and his statements about bleach and the blood and the other nonsense that he was promoting in the early period, but also the Democrats. I mean, they're promoting now, the banning of face masks. Throughout the course of the whole pandemic, there's been a systematic effort to prevent any understanding of the actual science and, of course, the actual implications, and to the removal of all restraints. The initial response, the initial lockdowns, which were sort of the initial measures to stop the spread, were very much the product of mass struggle of workers and the intervention of workers. Actually, here in Michigan and in Canada, auto workers were walking out as the pandemic first was spreading. But then the line was, the cure can't be worse than the disease, accepted by both the Democrats and the Republicans. And they've systematically dismantled all. Now there's not even measurement of infections. You have an estimate from wastewater. There's no effort to even study what the state of the pandemic is. So there's so much disinformation which is promoted in the media, but the pandemic continues. One of the elements one of the most criminal elements of the anti-scientific propaganda from the ruling class is the cover-up of the impact of long COVID. The fact that you have tens of millions of people who suffer from the effects of COVID long after infection, even permanently. One of the recent studies to come out found that even those who didn't have symptomatic infections, there was evidence of a cognitive decline for those who had been infected by COVID. A lot of the impact of this virus is still not known. So the pandemic has been a colossal experience, and it's ongoing. It's not over, contrary to the assertions of the entire political establishment and the media. So yes, we, Socialist Equality Party, we mask when indoors at our events, and we encourage all those who are coming to our indoor events to mask. We mask outside when there are crowds, and based upon the advice of our scientific or those who are studying the virus, what the most appropriate means of combating it are. In our meetings, we have far UV lamps, which are very effective in killing the virus and preventing infections. These are things which could be the far UV lamps could be in every office building and every classroom in the country, but of course they cost money. So we take the pandemic seriously, and we also try to speak to workers at every possible moment, or whenever possible, to talk to workers about the actual state of the pandemic, what has to be done to preserve their own health, to preserve the health of others, and try to educate and fight to educate the working class about the nature of the pandemic and what has to be done.
Hey,
go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I had a discussion with an Eaton aerospace worker on the picket line on Saturday, and he related that when the pandemic first hit, that they were told that they were, quote, essential workers in a company that makes defense manufacturing goods. But as Joe indicated, the auto workers in March 2020 carried out a series of wildcat strikes We, in fact, encouraged the development of these strikes. We urged workers to build rank and file safety committees because the United Auto Workers was working with the auto companies to keep manufacturing going. And there was an eruption of a series of wildcat strikes, which led to the shutdown of the industry for 2 months. But of course, who was it? Walensky, the CDC director, infamously said, "Well, look, this only affects those with pre-existing conditions and the elderly." And there has long been a debate, within the American ruling circles that people are simply living too long, that it's not affordable to pay Medicare and Social Security, and this is a virus which, in particular, affects the working class, older workers, and long COVID, as Joe indicated, is massive. It undermines the heart. It undermines the immune system. We know there's a worker who died of a heart attack, only 46 years old, at the Ford plant, Taiwan Long, and he had previously been hit by COVID. So no, we take this very seriously. We fight to build a powerful movement in alliance with scientists to fight for the elimination of the COVID virus. And of course, that can't be done on a national basis. It requires the coordination of such a struggle internationally, and that requires a struggle against the capitalist system.
And of course, your campaign has had a real impact, both in educating workers about the dangers of the pandemic, and it is significant that when one sees images of your meetings, there's large numbers of people who are in fact masking. So I think it's had a real impact. I wanted to return to the domestic aspect of the US's global wars. This week, your campaign published a statement in defense of Mamadou Tall, the Cornell University student who's facing deportation for participating in protests against the genocide in Gaza. You wrote that, quote, Tall has been targeted for his outspoken opposition to Israel's war on Gaza and his defense of the Palestinian people, and that his, quote, case is part of a broader nationwide assault on free speech and democratic rights on college campuses. So why is Tall being targeted?
Well, as the statement indicated, because of his opposition to the genocide. It's really an outrageous attack. He had participated in protests against military contractors, including, by the way, Boeing, which is very significant in relationship to the strike, which is ongoing. And we've been speaking, our comrades in the West Coast and Jerry have been speaking to workers at Boeing about what is happening to Tall at Cornell. But it's an outrageous attack on democratic rights. He's threatened with suspension from Cornell, which would mean, because he is an international student, he's Gambian, UK, is his background, which would mean that his visa would be revoked and he would be deported from the United States. There is very broad opposition on Cornell to this, and we, the Socialist Equality Party, our campaign calls for, and this can be developed, this can happen this week, in terms, and it could happen very quickly, that if there is a final decision to suspend him, that he could be deported very quickly. And we call for the mobilization of support throughout among students and in the working class at Cornell and beyond. And in particular, we call for strike action among members of the United Auto Workers at Cornell, as well as the UE, rank and file members, to demand and fight for strike action to block the deportation of Tall. This is it's an outrageous attack on democratic rights, and it's aimed at setting a precedent. The campuses are, after the protests last year, last semester, earlier this year, that were very much centered on the campuses. As the schools have opened up now in September, there's sort of police state atmosphere, which is being promoted. With police on the campus, greater restrictions on the ability to have protests, students being arrested There was a crackdown on a protest at the University of Michigan, which has led to the arrest of 11 students at that campus. At the same campus, our own campaigners for the Socialist Equality Party, as they were campaigning for an election meeting that I was going to speak at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, were cited by police for allegedly distributing leaflets without a proper permit, and have been banned from the university for a year from entering the university. This is and we're fighting that, but this is type of atmosphere. At the UC, they're banning face masks. You have an systematic effort to conflate opposition to the genocide with anti-Semitism, an outrageous lie that has been promoted throughout the course of the genocide. So you have a real effort to create a sort of police state environment on the campuses, which really go far beyond the measures even taken during the anti-Vietnam War protest movement. But it's the specific case of Tall and the broader measures which are being adopted on the campuses reflect a fear. And all the administrators, by the way, are tied with 1 million threads to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, corporate America, various hedge funds. I mean, the universities in this country have become really institutions of the state and of corporate America. But that the measures taken reflect a real fear, a fear within the ruling class, not only of opposition among students, but in particular that will develop and find a broader base in the working class. And everything that they are doing, all the measures that they are taking, all the anti-democratic actions that they are implementing, the police going on campus, beating up students, invited by the administrators themselves, all of these measures, outrages, really. So much for the universities as forums for free speech, democratic discussions, a marketplace of ideas. I mean, that's being repudiated. But all of this is bound up with concern, again, with the ruling class that this can, and it must become rooted in the working class. And the measures that they are taking against students will be used against workers who are fighting against the war, and against the development of the class struggle. I mean, it's really critical that the working class, these battles can't be fought on the campuses alone. The defense of democratic rights can't be fought on the campus alone. The opposition to the genocide cannot be waged on that basis. It has to be rooted in the working class and that social force, which really does have the power. And that's what we're fighting to. We're fighting to develop within the working class that understanding that they have to really take up this fight, because it's their fight. The fight to defend democratic rights, the fight against war, is inextricably connected to their own interests, to our interests, the working class.
Well, war abroad is war at home and war against the working class.
And the working class is going to be the ones who will be fighting and dying in these wars. I mean, the question of the draft is coming up again. They sort of sidelined that a little bit, but they were discussing it several months ago. And there was an outrage. I remember Jerry, we were speaking to youth in Detroit. What was that? Was that Labor Day, or was before the fireworks? And all the young workers were talking about the question of the draft, and there was a great deal of concern. They sort of, I think, shelved that just officially, perhaps until after the election. But who are they going to have fight these wars? It's always the rich man's war, the poor man's fight is true. I mean, they are going to try to dragoon workers into fighting. I mean, you have workers dying in the tens, hundreds of thousands in Ukraine and Russia. The Ukraine war they waged in the name of free Ukraine. They've used the Ukrainians as cannon fodder in their escalating global wars, to the point where they're actually trying to prevent poor workers elsewhere in Europe from receiving welfare payments if they're Ukrainian and fighting age, so that they'll be forced to return to Ukraine so that they can be thrown into the battle lines and die in the war against. So it's the working class that has the interests and must be mobilized in the fight against war and in the defense of democratic rights, because it's the same inextricably connected struggle.
But you raised Ukraine, of course. In Ukraine, our comrade Bogdan Sirachuk has been thrown in prison by the Zelensky regime because he's advanced the program of unifying both Russian and Ukrainian workers against both the Zelensky regime and the Putin regime, and against this imperialist war, which is evolving into what would inevitably erupt if a mass anti-war movement based on the working class doesn't prevent it, to nuclear war. But I think that the case of Mamadou Tal is a immensely serious precedent-setting case. First of all, it's not only happening in America. I just read a report that in Germany they are deporting people who use the phrase, from the river to the sea. You can be deported if you're seeking citizenship status, and it reminds me because I just did when I was in Seattle, I did a video noting the great general strike of 1919. But in the aftermath, during World War I and in the aftermath, it was the Democratic administration of Woodrow Wilson that carried out mass deportations and the first Red Scare to attack the industrial workers of the world, opponents of the war, mass roundups, censorship. And this is what they're trying to do. And it's being carried out once again by the Democratic Party in total alliance with the most right-wing, really anti-Semitic Republicans, who are slandering protesters, including Jewish youth, as anti-Semitic. And of course, Trump has said if he's elected, he will crush this movement. So
deport everyone too.
Yes, and deport them. Exactly.
That's what he said specifically. I just on the question, because you raised Bogdan, which is very important. It's been 5 months since the arrest of Comrade Bogdan in Ukraine by the Zelensky regime for opposing the war. And he's a fervent opponent of both the Ukrainian regime and the Russian government. Campaigns. He's a leading member of the Young Guard for Bolshevik Leninists, campaigning for the unification of the workers in Ukraine and Russia and throughout the Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And he's been in prison, held by this Zelensky regime, which, why talking about fascists and anti-Semites, have elevated into the highest levels of the state, and proclaiming as a national hero Stepan Bandera, the collaborator in the Holocaust, renaming streets off of for Nazi collaborators. This is the character of this government, and it is. I mean, you have a growing. And so I would actually, anyone listening, I urge everyone here to sign the petition to demanding the freedom for Comrade Bogdan and read more about it. I believe the URL is wsws.org/free Bogdan. But you do have everywhere the attack on democratic rights, the effort to criminalize opposition to war, and they'll use this against the working class. The attempt to criminalize strike. I mean, there is the threat which is overhanging the Boeing strike as well as the dock strike. Right now, the potential dock strike, which may begin at midnight tonight. Right now, the Biden administration is relying on the trade union apparatus to try to shut things down and wear workers out after they voted 96% to reject on Boeing the contract brought back by the union apparatus. Or they're using that, but they're using the apparatus. Oh, and I have to say, by the way, the dock union said beforehand that if there is a strike, they'll continue to ship military equipment. I mean, just demonstrating the connection between the trade union apparatus, Fain referred to the arsenal of democracy, and the war.
The domestic NATO.
Biden referred to the AFL-CIO as this domestic NATO. UAW President Sean Fain's talking about the arsenal of democracy that the UAW is helping to build military equipment. It should be the arsenal of genocide. This is the apparatus. It's not the workers. There's not broad support in the working class for the war. There is in the trade union apparatus, which knows where its bread is buttered and its $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 salaries come from and what it's supposed to do to get them. But the point is that right now they're relying on the trade union apparatus, but overhanging it is the threat of the invocation of Taft-Hartley or national security to shut down strikes, to repress and suppress directly and increasingly with violence class struggle. And Trump's fascist movement, what is the real target of that? Well, the story's always been the working class. That's what the effort to really actually cultivate a violent paramilitary movement is directed against. It's directed against any opposition to the corporate and financial oligarchy. So it's critical that the working class take this up. And again, this is what we're fighting for in our own election campaign.
Well, we are getting towards the end of our broadcast. I have one more question for each of you. This question is for Jerry. This month, Missouri executed Marcellus Williams, an innocent man. You wrote in a campaign statement that capital punishment must be abolished as a barbaric and anti-democratic relic of the past and outlawed as a violation of constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, all of the evidence demonstrated that he was absolutely innocent. Even the prosecutor's office, which carried out the indictment, the conviction, acknowledged and reversed themselves and called for his exoneration. But no, this demonstrated, and of course, it was all endorsed by the extreme right-wing fascists who sit on the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court. And it is just an indication of the absolutely ruthless, brutal character of American imperialism and its use of this barbaric medieval executions. And and of course, Kamala Harris is a supporter. I think, in fact, we wrote that the Democrats explicitly removed from their program this year any reference to abolishing capital punishment. They have to use such methods to deal with the growing social opposition in the working class, the massive social inequality. We've said many times that democracy is incompatible in a system in which there is such grotesque levels of social inequality. What is it? 50% of the bottom 50% owns something like 3% of the wealth in the country. It's all concentrated in the hands of a financial oligarchy. And what they are doing, war, austerity, is so antithetical to the interests of the broad masses of people that they can't do it without repression and authoritarian moves. And you have, on the one hand, as Joe indicated, Trump trying to build a fascist movement to deal with the enemy within, which is the working class. And then you have the Democrats who are working with the trade unions. By the way, Leon Trotsky famously said, in times of crisis, particularly war, trade union officials become government ministers. And that's what they're bringing and incorporating the trade union bureaucracy. But there is a massive social opposition that's building up in America and around the world against the efforts to impose the cost of war on the backs of the working class, and the issue of the fight against the capital punishment and all forms of state repression is very critical to the defense of democratic rights.
If I could just make a point about this, the mantra from the media, or whenever there's sort of a particularly violent incident in the United States, is there's no place for violence in American politics, or there's no place for violence. Like the state is dripping in violence. I mean, the case of Marcellus Williams is a particularly horrific expression. Someone who's clearly innocent. There were 1 million petitions signed to demand his clemency. The gang of fascists on the Supreme Court, and they should go down on their records, voted to deny the request, the appeal. The governor voted or decided not to grant clemency. In this case, a Republican. All the institutions, I mean, they made a decision to have this person who was clearly innocent killed. And I mean, it's the defense of this institution. I mean, you have a sense of the filth and rot sort of pouring out of spewing out of every pore of the American political system. And you can't separate that from the genocide in Gaza, the state which is completely culpable, ruling class, both its parties, after the this terror attack in Lebanon, where Israel exploded the pagers in Lebanon, killing how many it turned out to be, an act of outright criminality, terrorism. I mean, that is a terrorist act. You had jokes from within the one of the former Biden admission officials,
current Biden administration official.
Yeah, Lipset, joking about, do you have a beeper? And I mean, it expresses something in the nature of the ruling class. And I think the case of Marcellus Williams somehow embodies that. But it's the institution of the death penalty. It's sort of everything. This is a state which is, and a ruling class which in every sort of form is reached a political dead end. And I think that has to be really sort of worked through the implications of it, because ultimately it's not a question of this or that political figure. It's a question of the social economic system, capitalism. I mean, you can't separate, as Jerry was saying, from the oligarchic character. People like the anti-Semite Elon Musk, who owns Twitter. How much he got a $45 billion bonus awarded to him from Tesla shareholders. I mean, the principle of oligarchy, which infects every institution, Congress of millionaires, all the congressmen are essentially millionaires, senators, the Supreme Court, which exists as a complete continuous conspiracy against the democratic rights of the population for every decision, the executive presidency, the massive state police spying apparatus. By the way, the Democrats, there was a important article published on the World Socialist website on the CIA Democrats, documenting how a significant portion of the representatives of the Democratic Party are directly intelligence agencies or military officials. And Harris, of course, is going around touting the fact that she's endorsed by a gang of torturers and war criminals, former defense secretaries and CIA directors, Michael Hayden and others, Dick Cheney, who, for my generation, that was a defining experience, Cheney and the Iraq War and the torture memos where they, and supposedly this is about defending democracy. Bernie Sanders, I have to get into this, by the way, because Bernie Sanders issued a statement in relationship to Cheney endorsing Harris, saying that, well, we have our differences. I don't agree very much with Cheney, but he's a patriot and he's courageous for standing up for democracy. As if that has anything, Cheney's support for Harris has anything to do with democracy. This is a person who is guilty of monstrous crimes. The invasion of Iraq in particular, based on outright lies, which destroyed an entire society. Cheney was the leading force in the George W. Bush administration George W. Bush administration. So, I mean, and they drew up memos in the Bush administration saying that the president, as commander in chief, has the right to torture anyone because he has that power. They declare war without any oversight. This is the nature of the political system. But I did want to make the point. So just to go back to Marcellus Williams, but it's an expression of the whole the so-called justice system in America. Millions of people incarcerated, the death penalty, this barbaric institution, a relic from the Middle Ages, which has to be abolished. It's an expression of the nature of the capitalist state. But I did, if I can I speak about Sanders for a minute?
Of course.
I know we're getting to the end. We can perhaps take it a little bit longer, but I do think it's a critical experience because it relates to the issue you're talking about earlier, the genocide in Gaza and the lessons of the protests. Because there's got to be a settling of accounts with a whole sort of variety of politics, a politics of subordination to the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders was supposedly leading a political revolution against the billionaire class. Remember that in 2016 and 2020, 2012 and 2016. And what came of it? He endorsed Clinton, and then he endorsed Biden in 2016 and then 2020. And what has come out of that political revolution? He's now the chief supporter of the Biden administration, going on talk shows defending. This is the certain nature, the type of politics. And then you have Ocasio-Cortez. And she was elected first as a representative in Brooklyn. It was held by the whole sort of panoply of the pseudo-left, the DSA, Jacobin, and everyone else. This was the beginning of a sea change in American politics. What has Ocasio-Cortez become? This part of the Democratic Party establishment, a defender of the Biden-Harris administration, a policewoman against opposition from the left, declaring that socialists who oppose Biden are privileged, and a defender of the genocide and of war. And this whole type of politics, which there's been an experience, not only in the United States, but internationally, the Jeremy Corbyns, which has given birth to Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, is the leading figure demanding an escalation of the war against Russia. You have the experience of Syriza in Greece, which came to power back in 2015 and proceeded to implement IMF austerity measures after declaring that it was a government of the radical left and it was going to oppose it. You have Podemos in Spain. You have the Left Party in Germany. I'd add, by the way, the Green Party in Germany, which has a longer history, but is now one of the parties of German imperialism and the far and extremely right-wing politics. Propose the candidacy of Jill Stein here in the United States. But one has to sort of account for the whole type of politics, a politics which argues that you can deal with anything without dealing with capitalism, and that seeks to subordinate opposition into appeals to one or another section of the state. And that's the characteristic of the protests led by middle-class organizations against the genocide. They were animated by mass opposition in the working class, among young people, but the organizations involved directed it behind the Democratic Party. So somehow, the policy will be changed if somehow it was a mistake. And he would see, they would see that they had to change their policy, directing it behind the Democratic Party. What has become of that? A different politics is necessary, and it's necessary to a certain settling of accounts, again, with the politics of what we refer to as the pseudo-left, the politics of the upper middle class, the politics of factions of the Democratic Party, which seeks continuously to subordinate, to suppress. And by the way, there are now critical elements in the trade union apparatus. They function as guardians of the trade union apparatus, the DSA, labor notes, and others. But there has to be a settling of accounts, and really sort of working through. And I would encourage all those listening in today, as you sort of work through the experience, the character of the elections, the character of the problems we confront, to think about what type of politics is necessary. A working class politics, socialist politics, and what does that mean? And what is that connected to? It's bound up with a serious analysis of the political situation, of the nature of capitalism, and a serious analysis of the lessons of history, of historical experiences. Our movement, the Socialist Equality Party, is part of the International Committee of the Fourth International. The World Trotskyist movement, whose origins lie in the Russian Revolution, the conquest of power by the working class, the fight of Trotsky, led by Trotsky, against Stalinism, a particular form of bureaucratic reaction against the Russian Revolution, nationalism, which took really that horrific form in the purges directed at an entire generation of socialist intelligentsia and workers. But the fight for socialist internationalism throughout the history of the 20th century. Our movement has fought for a perspective which now I think is of the most pressing relevance. Or say it's, I think SEP National Chairman David North made the point in an event at Principio recently. The ideas of Trotsky are not merely relevant, that one cannot understand anything in the present situation. The rise of fascism, world war, the normalization of genocide. None of the problems that we confront without a serious understanding of the history of Trotsky, writings of Trotsky, and the history of the Trotskyist movement, which is in the International Committee of the Fourth International. And if I make a final point, the Socialist Equality Party, we're running an election campaign here in the United States, but as we said at the beginning of our announcement, we're not just directing our campaign to the United States. We are seeking. We are an international movement. We recognize that the problems confronting workers and young people in the United States are not problems unique to the United States, that the working class is an international class, that none of the problems that we confront can be resolved within the framework of a single country, that they're all global problems that require a global solution, and that is the mobilization of the international working class in revolutionary struggle against capitalism. And that is what our movement is seeking to build throughout the world. And again, if go back to the previous question, the purpose of our election campaign is to fight for this perspective in the working class, because there's no resolution of the problems we confront outside of that.
Well, I think that's a very strong segue to our last question of the night, which goes to both of you. Shane, a listener and a potential voter, says, as a socialist, my vote for the Democrats is strategic in that a Harris regime would offer greater space to maneuver and organize in contrast to a Trump Republican regime. I recognize that both are evil, but this vote is strategic. Your response, please.
Well, that's far from strategic. It's bound up with the whole pragmatic framework that Joe indicates, that every single election cycle, workers are bombarded with the claims that the Democratic Party is the lesser of two evils. But of course, this is a party which is waging relentless war, provoking the possibility of nuclear war, and collaborating with the Republicans in the suppression of democratic rights. I mean, Harris did not go to Springfield, Ohio to denounce the fascistic attacks, the fascist attacks on Asians. She went to the border to join the attacks of the Republicans and the claims that America is being bombarded by immigrants. As Joe indicated, it is time that workers and young people break from the whole framework and develop an independent political movement of the working class that fights for a revolutionary solution to the crisis of world capitalism. It's capitalism that produces war. It's capitalism that produces austerity and inequality. It's capitalism that produces the repression and fascism. I would just, if I could just say, I think, look, we said from the very beginning, the purpose of our running in this election campaign is to fight to raise the political consciousness of the working class and make it conscious that none of the problems confronting society today can be resolved outside of the working class taking political power in its own hands, expropriating the corporate financial oligarchy, and reorganizing society in the United States and internationally on the basis of socialism, the democratic and collective control of the working class, of all the wealth that we create, of the great productive forces created by mankind. I just want to digress for 1 minute. I was after I went to the picket lines in Jackson, Michigan, I visited the location where in 1854 the Republican Party was founded. It started as a gathering of those opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the spreading of slavery. But who would have thought in 1854 that the slave system and the power of the slave owners would be overthrown in a matter of a decade? And the capitalist system can also be overthrown. It is forcing millions into struggle. But the question is building a leadership, not adapting oneself to all the opportunist arguments that somehow you can work within the system. That has proven a complete dead end for the working class. We have to build this party. Of course, we're running in the elections, but we're building the Socialist Equality Party and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality to prepare the working class for what is going to come after these elections. And I want to second what Joe has to say, that you should donate to our campaign. You should join our campaign. You should build election committees in your neighborhoods, in your factories and workplaces, and build the necessary leadership to emancipate the working class.
If I could just, if I could just make a point on this. First of all, I understand that we have there's a growing audience on Twitter following the stream, and I think it's a reflection of the interest that there is in the socialist perspective. I just want to encourage everyone who's on now, and Jerry just laid out what you can do. I would encourage you, particularly right now, to sign up for. I want to make a couple points about what Jerry, the question actually, but I would encourage everyone who's listening now to sign up for updates for our election. Do we have that slide? Go and sign up. That's a volunteer, but go and sign up for the newsletter updates so that you'll get informed. We're going to have more discussions like this throughout the remainder of the campaign, and you get updates. You get our latest statements, and find out more about our election campaign. I just want to say one point about the this question. I mean, the Socialist Equality Party is not among those who minimize the danger posed by Trump, as Jerry was saying, and as we've been discussing. I mean, they are building up a real fascist movement, but one has to sort of approach this question politically. And the most dangerous conclusion, in fact, would be that somehow opposition to Trump can be waged through the Democratic Party. I mean, it is, in fact, such a devastating indictment of the past 4 years of the Biden and Harris administration that Trump, who sought to overthrow the Constitution in a fascistic coup in the last election, now was poised to potentially win in this election. And what does that say? The Democratic Party is completely incapable of appealing to the interests of the broad mass of the population. Its central priority is war. It has nothing to propose for the massive social crisis. When Trump can exploit that, and he uses that, as every right-wing demagogue does, to generate confusion and try to direct it in an extremely right-wing direction. Even he's trying to posture as an opponent of war, which he's not. The Republicans are not. But given that the Democrats are, filthy, raving at the mouth warmongers over nuclear war and war against Russia, Trump can raise this in his demagogic way. So the question of fighting, I mean, there has to be a movement against fascism, but that requires, as an essential foundation, the fight to develop precisely within the working class an independent movement based on its interests. And that's how you're going to go back to the point Jerry was making about the Boeing story. That's how you're going to undermine the Trump's support. And there's not millions and millions of workers in the United States who want a fascist dictatorship. That's not the case. Trump is able to exploit social grievances. And the way to undermine that is to develop a movement in the working class which articulates its genuine interests, which means the development of a movement against capitalism and against the Democratic Party and against war. So that's the critical question. And that's why we're intervening in this election, why we're fighting against both these parties. We are fighting because the issue of all issues, the most critical, the central question which we confront, which workers and young people confront, is the fight to build a socialist leadership in the working class. There's not a way forward outside of that. That is the task. And again, there's not, we don't have endless time either. The ruling class is hurtling towards world war. It's in the initial stages. It's hurtling towards dictatorship, the assault on democratic rights, the escalating war in the working class. And the working class has got to fight back, but for that, it requires a political perspective, a political leadership. That's what we're fighting to develop through the Socialist Equality Party election campaign. Again, perhaps this is going towards a conclusion, but I would encourage everyone listening to sign up for updates, follow us on social media, me and Jerry on Twitter and TikTok, wherever you're watching this stream, YouTube, to get updates. Make a donation, whatever you can give to our election campaign. We don't have the support of corporate donors. We need financial support. Anything you can give, up to the maximum. And sign up to volunteer. We want to develop this campaign throughout the country in the next 5 weeks, getting out to as many workplaces as possible, distributing leaflets, going to the campuses, having further meetings. Sign up to become involved and take up this campaign as your own. and really make the decision, study our program, study the perspective of the SCP. You can find out more at socialism2024.org, all the statements we published and the program we're running on, and make the decision to join the Socialist Equality Party.
Well, I think that's a really fitting conclusion to this really critical event. I'd like to thank both of you for your very thoughtful responses to these questions. Is there anything else that you'd like to encourage those listening today to do to support your campaign beyond what you've already mentioned? And Jerry, did you have any further concluding remarks?
Well, again, we are urging workers and young people to join, volunteer, donate. I think in particular, we would urge you to build inside of your factories and workplaces committees of workers who support our campaign, who will fight for it, and to see this campaign as the development of a powerful counteroffensive, both an industrial and political counteroffensive from the working class. So I would just leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you both very much, and thank all of our listeners for tuning in. This is the first of several such events that we will be holding over the course of the remaining weeks of the campaign. Please continue to follow Joe and Jerry's social media for the announcement of the next interview event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.